Hook. She called it worthless. The room went silent the second the drone hit the floor. Not a dramatic silence, the uncomfortable kind, where 200 people in expensive suits all decide at the same moment to look somewhere else. Celeste Ashford didn't flinch. She walked past the wreckage in her heels, glanced down once, and said 4 words into a live microphone that would follow Nathan Mercer for the rest of his career. This is a toy. If you've ever built something with your bare hands, poured 3 years of your life into it, and watched someone destroy it in 4 seconds flat, hit that like button right now, drop your city and country in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled, and stay with me until the very end. Because what happens next in these mountains will change everything you think you know about who gets to decide what's worth saving. The morning of the demonstration, Nathan Mercer arrived at Sterling Aerospace headquarters at 5:43. Not because he was required to. The event didn't start until 9. He arrived because he hadn't slept, and lying in his apartment staring at the ceiling felt worse than doing something useful. He drove through the empty downtown streets with a cup of gas station coffee going cold in the cup holder, and the drone's diagnostic readout cycling on his laptop in the passenger seat. Falcon X was as ready as it was ever going to be. That thought should have been comforting. It wasn't. Sterling Aerospace occupied a glass and steel tower in the financial district, the kind of building designed to make you feel small before you'd even push through the revolving door. Nathan had worked there for 6 years, long enough to know every shortcut through the parking structure, long enough to recognize which security guards would wave him through without checking his badge, long enough to understand that the company he joined wasn't quite the company it had become. He used the loading dock entrance, same as always, and took the freight elevator up to Lab 7. The drone sat in its transport case, packed with the kind of care you'd give something fragile and irreplaceable. Which it was. Falcon X wasn't pretty. He'd heard that enough times to stop arguing. The frame was welded aluminum with visible seam marks where he'd had to strip and rebuild sections twice. The sensor housing was asymmetrical because the original casing had cracked during a field test, and he'd improvised with what was in the repair shop. 3 of the 6 rotor arms had been replaced after a rough landing in the Bitter Peak trial run. The thing looked, as his former colleague Dennis had once put it, like a hardware store had a fight with a science project. But it flew in conditions that grounded everything else. That was the part nobody wanted to hear at the executive level, where success was measured partly by how good something looked in a press release photo. Nathan unpacked the drone carefully, ran the startup sequence, checked the battery cells one more time. All green. He'd spent the last 3 weeks running simulations for exactly the kind of wind shear conditions the demo hall's ventilation system could produce. He'd mapped every variable he could think of. He hadn't mapped Celeste Ashford's patience. By 8:15, the room was filling up. The demonstration space occupied the entire ground floor atrium. High ceilings, polished concrete, a temporary stage with a podium, and a screen behind it showing a looping reel of Sterling Aerospace brand imagery. Rescue helicopters over mountain ranges. Emergency responders with company logos on their gear. The tagline scrolling underneath, "Innovation that saves lives." Nathan stood near the staging area with Falcon X on its launch pad and watched the room fill with people who had never heard of him. Board members, investors, defense procurement officers in civilian clothes, 3 journalists from aerospace trade publications, a camera crew from a local news affiliate that had been given exclusive access in exchange for favorable coverage, which everyone understood and nobody said out loud. Mara Voss found him at 8:30. She was the project liaison, the person who had, in theory, been advocating for Falcon X at the executive level for the past 18 months. In practice, Mara spent most of her energy managing the gap between what the engineering team was building and what the C-suite thought they'd commissioned. She was good at it. She was also visibly stressed. "How's the bird?" she said. "Good. You sure?" "I ran the checks twice this morning." Mara looked at Falcon X the way someone looks at a car that's broken down on them before. "Nathan, I need you to hear me clearly. Celeste is in a mood. She had a board call last night about the Vantage acquisition, and it didn't go well. Whatever happens in there, you need to stay calm, you need to keep it professional, and you need the drone to perform." "The drone will perform," Nathan said. "I'm not just talking about the drone." He didn't answer that.
Papas.
Celeste Ashford took the stage at 9:02. She was 51 years old with the kind of posture that made a room recalibrate itself around her. Silver-streaked hair pulled back, a charcoal blazer that probably cost more than Nathan's monthly car payment. She had the practiced ease of someone who had stood in front of crowds like this for decades and had stopped finding it interesting about halfway through. Her opening remarks were sharp, efficient, and entirely about Sterling Aerospace's upcoming acquisition of Vantage Dynamics. The Falcon X demonstration was positioned as a proof-of-concept segment, a glimpse at the company's broader rescue technology portfolio, she said, that reinforced their commitment to operational innovation. Nathan stood off stage and heard his 3 years reduced to a half sentence. He breathed through it. The demonstration protocol was straightforward. Falcon X would launch from the pad, navigate a timed obstacle course designed to simulate mountain search conditions, use its thermal imaging to locate a heat signature target, and return to base. The whole sequence was supposed to take 11 minutes. Nathan had run it in 9:40 during the last practice flight. He carried Falcon X to the launch position. The room shifted. Some people leaned forward, others pulled out phones. The drone was ugly under the atrium lights. He could see a few people exchange glances. Celeste stepped back from the podium and gave him a tight nod. Nathan armed the system and launched. For the first 90 seconds, everything was right. Falcon X moved through the obstacle course with the ugly, deliberate precision of something built for function instead of appearance. Not graceful, not impressive looking, but controlled, exact, reading the room's airflow patterns and adjusting constantly, the way the algorithm was designed to do in actual mountain conditions. Nathan watched the telemetry on his tablet. All green. The drone cleared the third gate, banked toward the thermal target, acquisition lock confirmed. Then the left rotor arm seized. Not a gradual failure. Instant. Like something had killed the motor mid-flight. Falcon X dropped 4 feet before the redundancy system kicked in, and by then the angle was wrong, the trajectory was wrong, and the drone came down hard on the demonstration floor with a sound like a toolbox falling off a shelf. The room went silent. Nathan crossed the floor in about 8 steps. He crouched down and picked up Falcon X. The left arm had separated at the joint. The rotor was intact. He turned the arm over and looked at the connection point, and something wrong registered in the back of his mind. Something he'd examine later. Something that didn't quite fit the failure mode he'd have expected. He heard heels on polished concrete. Celeste Ashford stopped a few feet away, hands clasped in front of her, and looked at the drone in his hands the way you'd look at something you'd already decided to throw away. "This," she said, and her voice carried across the silent atrium without her raising it at all, "is what 6 years and $4 million in development budget produces?" The failure was a crash in front of our board, in front of procurement officers, in front of cameras. She looked at him directly for the first time. "Mr. Mercer, what I'm looking at is a machine that doesn't work, that was never going to work, built to look like something assembled in a garage. This is not what Sterling Aerospace presents to the world. The flight data will show, I don't need flight data, I need results." She glanced at the drone one more time, dismissive, final. "This project is terminated, effective today. Please collect your personal belongings and have your access cards returned to security before noon." "You're shutting it down." "I'm cutting a loss." She turned away. "You can keep the toy." Mara found him in Lab 7 40 minutes later. He was sitting at his workbench with Falcon X in front of him, the separated rotor arm under the magnification light. He'd been staring at the same connection point for the better part of half an hour. "Nathan, the motor didn't fail," he said. "I know you're—" "Mara." He turned the arm under the light so she could see. "Look at the mounting collar. The retaining pin is gone. It's not stripped. It's not broken. It's gone. You don't lose a retaining pin in flight. That pin was removed." Mara looked at it. Her expression didn't change the way he expected it to. "You're going to want to be careful about what you say next," she said quietly. "I'm telling you what I'm looking at. I know what you're telling me, and I'm telling you that you are a terminated employee in a building you need to leave before noon. And if you start making accusations about sabotage without evidence that would survive 5 minutes in a legal proceeding, the only person who ends up damaged is you." Someone pulled that pin. "Pack your personal items," she said. Please. She left. Nathan sat with Falcon X for another few minutes, turning the arm over in his hands. Then he pulled out his phone and started photographing the joint, the missing pin housing, the collar. Methodical, quiet, the way he'd been taught to document equipment failures in the field, back before he'd ended up behind a desk. He photographed everything. Then he packed his tools, loaded Falcon X into its transport case, and left the building through the freight elevator and the loading dock, the same way he'd come in. In the atrium above him, the camera crew was packing up their equipment and the last of the investors were filtering toward the exits. On the screen behind the empty podium, the looping reel was still running. Rescue helicopters over mountain ranges, emergency responders in Sterling gear, the tagline cycling through. Innovation that saves lives. Outside, the first clouds were stacking over the Bitter Peak Range to the north. Ahem. The storm came in faster than the weather services predicted. That happens sometimes with mountain weather. The models caught the broad shape of it, but missed how quickly the upper elevation pressure systems could organize. By Friday evening, what had been forecast as a winter advisory had become a full storm warning, and the Bitter Peak peaks were buried in cloud down to 4,000 feet. Nathan was in his apartment with Falcon X on the kitchen table, working his way through 4 years of maintenance logs and looking for other anomalies, when his phone buzzed with the news alert. Sterling Aerospace CEO, helicopter missing. Bitter Peak Mountains. He read it twice. The helicopter had gone down sometime in the early afternoon during what was supposed to be a site survey flight over the company's proposed northern expansion zone. Emergency locator signals had activated briefly, then gone silent. Search and rescue coordination was in contact with the FAA. Weather conditions had forced search helicopters to abort 2 attempts before nightfall. Nathan set his phone down and looked at Falcon X. The drone looked back at him. If a machine can be said to do that, scarred and asymmetrical under the kitchen light, one arm still loose from where he'd started the disassembly before his mind had gone somewhere else. He thought about the retaining pin. He thought about the missing locator signal. He thought about a woman standing in an atrium saying, "I don't need flight data," in front of 200 people, and the particular expression on her face, not cruel exactly, just certain. Certain the way people get when they've been right about enough things for long enough that being wrong stops feeling like a real possibility. He picked up his phone again and pulled up the weather radar for the Bitter Peak Range. The storm was sitting directly over the search zone, a solid mass of white on the screen, and the forecast track showed it holding position through the weekend. Helicopters couldn't fly in that. He knew something that could. Nathan sat at his kitchen table for a long time after that, not moving, the storm radar cycling on his phone and Falcon X disassembled in front of him. A man trying to decide something he'd probably already decided. He started putting the drone back together. He finished reassembling Falcon X at 11:47 in the evening. He knew that because he checked the time when he tightened the last rotor mount, a habit from fieldwork. Always time-stamp the moment a machine goes back together, so you know exactly how long it's been since the last full check. The kitchen smelled like machine oil and cold coffee. His back ached from hunching over the table. The storm radar on his phone hadn't changed. The white mass sat over Bitter Peak like something that had decided to stay. He didn't sleep. He loaded Falcon X into the truck and drove north before 4 in the morning. The Rescue Coordination Center was set up in the parking lot of a ranger station at the base of Bitter Peak's eastern approach. 3 command tents, a generator running loud in the dark, satellite dishes angled up into cloud cover that blocked every star. Nathan counted 2 state police vehicles, 1 county sheriff SUV, a search and rescue van with its rear doors open and equipment half unpacked, and a Sterling Aerospace Company car parked closest to the main tent. Engine off, but someone sitting in the driver's seat. He parked at the edge of the lot and sat for a minute with the truck idling. He wasn't sure what he'd expected. Something more organized, maybe. Or more chaotic. This was neither. It was the tired, grinding kind of emergency response that sets in. After the first crisis, adrenaline burns off and everyone is left with the reality of a problem they don't know how to solve yet. He pulled the transport case from the truck bed and carried it toward the main tent. The man who stopped him was big, mid-50s, wearing a county search and rescue jacket, with a coordinator patch on the shoulder. Name tag said Greer. He had the look of someone who had been awake for 18 hours and had stopped being polite about it somewhere around hour 12. "This is a restricted coordination area," Greer said. "Media staging is at the highway junction, quarter-mile back." "I'm not media." "Then you need to identify yourself and explain why you're here." "Nathan Mercer. I'm an aerospace engineer. I built a search drone that can operate in the conditions you're dealing with up there." Nathan set the case down and opened the latches. "I want to help." Greer looked at the drone. His expression didn't shift. "We have drones. Military grade? 2 commercial units. We couldn't launch either one. Wind tolerance is 32 miles per hour." He paused. "Sustained gusts up there are currently running 58. Falcon X is rated to 70, Nathan said. "Field tested in the Bitter Peak range specifically. I've got 2 years of flight logs in this terrain if you want to look at them." Greer studied him for a long moment. Then he looked at the drone again. The asymmetrical frame, the mismatched rotor housings, the weld seams. "You built this yourself?" "Yes." "It looks like it." "I know." "The CEO of Sterling Aerospace is on that mountain," Greer said. "Her pilot and 2 executives are with her. If something goes wrong with your machine up there, and those people die because we wasted time on a field experiment—" "Something's already gone wrong," Nathan said. "That's why I'm here." Greer held his gaze for another 3 seconds. Then he turned toward the main tent. "Come with me, Itas." The inside of the tent smelled like wet gear and instant coffee. 4 people around a folding table with topographic maps and laptop screens. A woman in a state police uniform was on a radio handset, talking in clipped half-sentences. 2 men Nathan didn't recognize were marking search grid coordinates. The 4th person at the table was someone Nathan did recognize. Damian Cross, Sterling Aerospace's chief operations officer. He was 53, built like a former athlete who'd spent the last decade behind a desk, and he was wearing a jacket that was too clean for a rescue operation, the kind of jacket you grabbed because it was visible and authoritative, not because you expected to work in it. He had a company-issued satellite phone in one hand and a thermal mug in the other. And when Nathan walked in, he looked up with the specific expression of a man who thought he was running things until someone with actual authority walked in. His eyes landed on Nathan and went flat. "What is he doing here?" Damian said. Greer glanced between them. "You 2 know each other?" "He's a former Sterling employee." Damian's voice was even. "Terminated earlier this week." "He has a drone that might be able to fly in current conditions," Greer said. "He has a prototype that crashed in front of our entire board of directors 2 days ago." Damian set his coffee down. "Commander Greer, I want to be very clear. This man has no authorization to represent Sterling Aerospace Technology in any capacity, and frankly, I question the judgment of introducing unstable equipment into an active rescue operation." "It's not Sterling Aerospace Technology," Nathan said. "I built it independently. Sterling funded early development, but the core design IP is mine. That's not how your employment contract reads." "We can argue about the contract later. Right now there are 4 people on that mountain. And the last thing those 4 people need is a rogue engineer running a field test with a broken drone during their rescue operation." The woman with the radio handset lowered it. Her name tag read, Captain Devlin. She had short hair going gray at the temples, and she looked at the 2 of them the way someone looks at an argument they don't have time for. "Does your drone actually fly in 58-mile-per-hour gusts?" she asked Nathan. "Yes." "You have documentation. Flight logs, terrain data, 2 years of operational tests in the Bitter Peak range." Devlin looked at Greer. Greer shrugged. Not dismissive, the kind of shrug that means this is your call, and I'll back whatever you decide. "Show me the logs," Devlin said. Damian Cross opened his mouth. "Mr. Cross," Devlin said without looking at him, "you're here as a liaison for the missing party. That's appreciated. But operational decisions in this tent belong to Search and Rescue Command. If you'd like to step outside—" "I'll stay," Damian said. "Then stay quiet." Nathan spent 40 minutes with Devlin and Greer going through the flight logs on his laptop. He showed them the Bitter Peak field tests, wind speeds, elevation data, battery performance in sub-zero temperatures, the thermal imaging specs. He walked them through the sensor suite, the redundancy systems, the fail-safes built into the navigation algorithm. Devlin asked good questions. Greer asked better ones. Neither of them was easy about it, and Nathan didn't expect them to be. "The crash at the Sterling demo," Devlin said at one point. "What happened?" "A retaining pin was missing from the left rotor arm mounting collar," Nathan said. "The motor seized on launch transition." "Mechanical failure?" Nathan paused one beat too long. "That's what's being investigated." Devlin caught the pause. She didn't push on it, but she noted it. He could see that. "If we authorize a search flight," she said, "you're operating under my direct command. Flight path, search grid, abort conditions. My call on all of it." "Understood. If the drone goes down in there, we don't send anyone in after it." "I know. And if this works..." She glanced at the topographic map, the search zone marked in red, the storm system overlaid in gray. "It works. You don't own what it finds. All data goes directly to Rescue Command." "That's the only reason I'm here," Nathan said. Devlin looked at him for a moment. Not warm, not unfriendly, just reading him. "Get your equipment ready," she said. But he launched Falcon X at 6:12 in the morning, 40 minutes before first gray light. The wind hit the drone the second it cleared the tree line, a hard lateral gust that shoved it sideways and made the stabilization system work for the correction. Nathan felt it in his hands through the controller, felt the system compensate, and made himself breathe slowly. Behind him, Devlin and Greer stood watching the monitor feed from Falcon X's cameras, terrain scrolling beneath in thermal green, pine canopy giving way to rock and ice above the 3,000-foot line. "Wind speed?" Devlin said. 53 at current elevation," Nathan said. "It'll hit 60+ above the ridge. And you're comfortable with that." "The drone is." Falcon X climbed. On the thermal feed, the world became rock and snow and cold air. The temperature differential between the living forest below and the frozen terrain above rendered in gradients of green and black. The helicopter's last known position was 12 miles northeast, a logging road survey point where the flight plan had been filed to. From there, the crash site could be anywhere in a 14 square mile zone, depending on how far the helicopter had traveled before going down. 14 square miles of vertical terrain in a full mountain storm. Greer had been right about the other drones. Nathan's commercial units would have been shredded. Falcon X moved through the gusts with the same ugly, deliberate correction that had made people frown at it in the demo hall. Not graceful, not impressive to watch, but it held altitude, held heading, pushed north and east into the dark above the ridge, while every other piece of equipment in the rescue operation sat grounded and useless in the parking lot below. "Getting interference on the camera feed," Nathan said about 20 minutes into the flight. "Wind moisture in the sensor housing. It'll stabilize when I get above the precipitation layer." "How long?" "Few minutes." The feed flickered. Thermal noise crossed the image in horizontal bands. Nathan didn't like the look of it, but he'd seen it before in the high-altitude tests, and he kept the drone on heading and waited. The feed cleared, and Damian Cross's voice came from behind him, quiet and tight, talking into his satellite phone. Nathan caught maybe 6 words before Damian moved away from the tent opening. "Enough." Monitoring and frequency and something that sounded like a channel number. He kept his eyes on the monitor and his hands on the controller and stored what he'd heard in the same careful place he'd stored the photograph of the missing retaining pin. The search took 3 hours and 11 minutes. Not dramatic. Not like in the movies where the answer comes in a rush. It came in increments, in the grinding logic of search grid elimination. Nathan flew Falcon X through sector after sector, the thermal imaging reading rock and ice, and the occasional heat signature of a mountain animal. His hands were cold even in the heated tent. He drank bad coffee that someone handed him without looking away from the monitor. The storm above the ridge showed no sign of loosening. Devlin spelled Greer on the radio at hour 2. Greer brought a folding chair and sat next to Nathan without speaking, watching the monitor with the exhausted patience of someone who had done this work long enough to understand that waiting was most of it. At hour 3, Nathan picked up an anomaly. Not a heat signature, a structural one. A shape that didn't match the terrain, partially buried under wind-driven snow on a ledge below the Coldwater Cliffs. Wrong angles for rock, wrong reflectivity pattern. He brought Falcon X lower, fighting a hard crosswind to hold the descent. There, he said. Greer leaned forward. On the thermal feed, a pale shape resolved through the snow cover. Curved surfaces, a rotor assembly, the crumpled frame of a helicopter that had come down hard against the cliff face and slid about 30 yards down the rock before the snow stopped it. That's them, Greer said. Nathan pushed the drone lower still, the wind battering it on the descent, the stabilization system firing in rapid corrections. The camera swept across the wreckage, and then, there. Movement. A human-shaped heat signature in the thermal frame, then a second, partially sheltered by the broken fuselage. I've got survivors, Nathan said. His voice came out flat because if he let any other register into it right now, he wasn't going to be useful. At least two, possibly more behind the frame. Devlin was already on the radio. Behind Nathan, Damian Cross had gone quiet in a way that was different from before. Not the quiet of someone watching and waiting, the quiet of someone recalculating. Nathan held Falcon X in position over the wreck site, fighting the wind, feeding the camera data to the rescue command screen. On the monitor, one of the heat signatures moved again. Slow, deliberate, the movement of someone injured but conscious, trying to make themselves visible. Someone down there knew a drone was above them. Someone down there was still fighting. He kept Falcon X in position and fed the coordinates to Devlin's team and didn't look away from the monitor, and the storm churned above the Bitter Peak ridgeline with no interest in any of them. Well, the problem came through on the coordinate relay 12 minutes later. Greer laid it out on the topo map with a grease pencil, marking the crash site and the terrain between it and any viable rescue approach. Nathan looked at it and felt the specific weight of a problem that doesn't have a clean solution. The helicopter had come down on a ledge below the Coldwater Cliffs, accessible from the north face in good conditions, a standard technical climb. But between that northern approach and the crash site was a ravine, 60 feet across and dropping 200 feet to a frozen creek bed, and the storm had sheeted ice across every surface above 7,000 feet. The ravine had one crossing point, a natural rock bridge that the survey maps showed as passable in summer. Is it still there? Nathan asked. The bridge? Greer traced the line on the map. Based on the drone imagery, yes, but the approach on both sides is glazed. We'd be asking our team to cross 60 feet of slick rock at 200 feet altitude and 50-mile-per-hour wind, in the dark, with an unknown number of injured survivors waiting on the other side. What are the options? With current equipment and current conditions, we wait for the storm to break and bring helicopters in from above. Greer paused. Earliest viable window the Weather Service is projecting is 48 hours. The survivors don't have 48 hours. Nathan said it without drama because it wasn't a dramatic statement. It was a fact, and Greer knew it, and both of them stood with it for a moment. What I need, Greer said carefully, is a way to get a climbing line across that ravine. If we can establish an anchor on the far side, we can rig a fixed line and our team can cross with proper protection. Nathan looked at the ravine measurements on the screen. 60 feet. He looked at Falcon X. My drone can carry a line across, he said. A climbing rope? Not a full rope. Too heavy in this wind, but a lightweight guide line. 100-pound test spectra cord. Maybe 120 feet of it. Your team hauls the guide line across, uses it to pull the main rope. Greer was quiet for a moment. You'd have to fly directly over the ravine in crosswind conditions, controlled enough to drop the line on the far anchor point. I know. If the drone goes down in the crossing, then we're back to waiting, Nathan said. But right now it's the option we have. Greer looked at him the way he'd looked at him in the parking lot 3 hours ago, measuring something that couldn't be measured on a spec sheet. Get the line rigged, he said. Nathan was already moving. He was pulling spectra cord from the equipment supply when he felt someone step close behind him. He turned. Damian Cross stood 2 feet away, and the expression on his face wasn't the contained corporate irritation from earlier. Something else had come into it. Something tighter, more careful. You need to stop here, Damian said, low enough that it didn't carry to the others. Whatever you think you're doing, Mercer, this isn't the place for it. I'm rigging a guideline. I'm not talking about the line, Damien's jaw was set. I'm talking about the data. What the drone has been collecting. Flight logs, telemetry, sensor records. Whatever you think you found up there, I've found 4 survivors on a cliff ledge, Nathan said. That's what I've found. Don't be stupid. I'm working, Nathan said. Step back. Damien held his ground for one more second. Nathan held his. Then Devlin's voice cut across the tent, sharp, commanding, the voice of someone who had run out of patience for things that weren't the emergency. Mercer, how long to rig that line? Nathan turned away from Damien. 8 minutes. You've got 6, Devlin said. Move. He moved. The Spectra cord weighed 11 ounces. Nathan had measured it twice because weight mattered when you were asking a damaged drone to carry a payload across 60 feet of open ravine in a crosswind that had already shoved Falcon X sideways twice on the ascent. He'd rigged a simple release mechanism from a carabiner and a length of steel cable. Nothing elegant, the kind of thing you built in 6 minutes with whatever the equipment tent had available. Greer's team lead, a woman named Ruiz, who moved with the economical precision of someone who'd done technical rescue in bad conditions before, had checked the rigging without comment and given him a single nod. That was enough. Nathan launched Falcon X for the second time at 9:41 in the morning. The wind above the ridge had climbed to 62 miles per hour since the first flight. He felt it in the controller resistance, felt the drone working harder to hold heading as it crossed the tree line and pushed north toward the Coldwater Cliffs. On the monitor, the terrain below was bone white, ice on every surface, snow driven horizontal by the wind, the ravine cutting across the search zone like a wound that wouldn't close. Behind him in the tent, nobody spoke. Devlin stood with her arms crossed and her eyes on the monitor. Greer was on the radio with his team, who were positioned at the northern approach waiting for the line to cross. Ruiz had moved to the tent entrance where she could watch the drone's position against the sky. A small dark shape fighting its way through gray air, ugly and deliberate. Damien Cross was also behind him. Nathan knew because he could hear the man breathing. He didn't look back. Falcon X reached the ravine edge at 9:49. On the monitor, the drop resolved into view. 200 feet of empty air and ice-covered rock below. The frozen creek bed, a thin white line at the bottom. The far anchor point was a rock formation Greer's team had identified from the topo maps, a natural horn of granite that had survived every winter the Bitter Peak Range had thrown at it. If Nathan could drop the line's weighted end within 8 feet of that horn, Ruiz's team could work with it. 8 feet, 60 feet of open air, 62-mile-per-hour crosswind. He made the approach 3 times before he was satisfied with the angle. The first pass, the wind pushed the drone 2 feet left of line before he corrected. Second pass, he overcorrected right. Third pass, he held the approach angle and felt the system lock into the compensation rhythm, the ugly back-and-forth adjustment that wasn't graceful but was precise, and precision was what mattered. He triggered the release. The cord dropped. On the monitor, the weighted end swung in the wind, a long, terrible moment where it looked like the crosswind was going to take it clean off the horn, and then it caught, looped once around the granite, and held. "Line is down," Nathan said. Greer was already talking into the radio. What happened in the next 40 minutes was Ruiz's work, not Nathan's. He stepped back from the controller, let Falcon X hold position above the site, and watched on the secondary monitor as Greer's 4-person team crossed the ravine hand over hand on the guideline, hauling the main rope behind them. It was slow. It looked brutal. The wind was full in their faces the whole way, and the ice on the rock walls of the ravine meant every anchor they set took twice as long as it should have. But they crossed. All 4 of them, one at a time, and on the far side they moved toward the wreckage with the kind of focused, mechanical speed that trained rescue personnel get when the work finally starts. Nathan kept Falcon X in position overhead, the camera tracking the team's approach to the helicopter. He was watching the monitor when the notification came through on his laptop. Not an alarm, a quiet flag from the drone's data logging system, something he'd built into the firmware 18 months ago as a diagnostic tool. The system monitored its own telemetry against baseline parameters, and when something fell outside expected range, it logged the anomaly and flagged it for review. The flag that had come through wasn't about flight performance. It was about the radio spectrum. Falcon X's sensor suite included a passive RF monitor, originally built to detect emergency locator frequencies in search operations. During the second flight, the system had logged a transmission on a specific encrypted frequency, not the SAR coordination channels, not aviation emergency bands, a private frequency, the kind used by corporate encrypted communication systems. The transmission had originated from inside the rescue coordination tent, and the system had logged the timestamp, 9:31 in the morning, 18 minutes before the guideline crossing. 14 minutes after Damian Cross had stepped close to Nathan and told him to stop. Nathan stared at the flag on his screen for a long moment. Then he closed the laptop, quietly, and kept his face on the main monitor where Ruiz's team was reaching the crash site. They brought the survivors out in 2 hours and 19 minutes. Celeste Ashford came first. She was ambulatory. Barely. She'd taken a hard impact to the left side during the crash, and her left arm was immobilized against her chest with improvised strapping. She moved under her own power across the rope system with Ruiz's team on either side. Her face set in an expression that had nothing performative in it, just the raw concentration of someone putting one hand in front of the other because stopping wasn't an option. Her pilot, a man named Cobb, had a broken collarbone and a laceration above his left eye that had bled extensively. He crossed with assistance. One of the executives, a woman Nathan didn't recognize, had a probable concussion but was mobile. The fourth survivor, a man in his 40s, one of Sterling's site survey team, had to be brought across on a litter, his right ankle broken in 2 places from the impact. All 4 alive. Greer's team had them in the medical tent within 12 minutes of reaching the parking lot. Nathan was breaking down Falcon X at his truck when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned, expecting Devlin or Greer. It was Celeste. She had a thermal blanket around her shoulders and a bandage on her left temple he hadn't noticed from across the lot. She was still wearing the company jacket she'd had on for the site survey flight, torn at the right shoulder, dark with what might have been blood or motor fluid or both. She looked like she'd spent 26 hours on a frozen cliff, which was because she had. She stopped about 6 feet away. Nathan waited. "The drone found us," she said. Not a question. "Yes." She looked at Falcon X in the transport case. The same drone she'd held in a live microphone 4 days ago and called a toy. She looked at it for a while without speaking. "I was told the rescue effort had no viable aerial option due to weather conditions," she said finally. Her voice was steady, but there was something under it, the specific roughness of someone who has been talking themselves through fear for a very long time and is now running on empty. "That was accurate for conventional systems," Nathan said, "but not for this one." "No." Celeste was quiet again. Nathan kept working, folding the transport padding around the drone's frame, latching the case clasps. He didn't know what to do with the silence, so he worked through it. "Mr. Mercer." Her voice had changed register slightly. "I need to ask you something directly." "All right. Were you told to come here? By anyone?" He straightened up and looked at her. "No, I drove up on my own." "Why?" It was a simple question, and it deserved a simple answer, and he found he didn't have one that wasn't going to sound like something he'd rehearsed. So he told her the truth the plain way. "Because the drone could fly in those conditions," he said, "and people were up there. That was enough." Celeste held his gaze. Her face was hard to read, not cold the way it had been in the atrium, but closed in the way people get when they're processing something they haven't finished processing yet. "My emergency locator failed," she said. "It activated briefly after impact, and then went silent." Nathan didn't say anything. "That's the third piece of Sterling emergency equipment to malfunction in a significant incident in 14 months, she said. "I've been told twice that the cause was environmental stress. User error once." A pause. "Does that number mean anything to you?" "It might," Nathan said carefully. "Then I think you and I need to have a conversation," Celeste said. "Not here." She turned and walked back toward the medical tent. Nathan watched her go, and then looked across the parking lot to where Damian Cross was standing by the company car, satellite phone in hand, watching both of them with an expression that was as flat and unreadable as a closed door. The conversation happened in the cab of Nathan's truck, with the heater running and rain starting to come down, the storm breaking up at the edges, dropping its load as it dissipated. Celeste sat in the passenger seat with the thermal blanket still around her shoulders and her injured arm cradled against her body, and Nathan sat behind the wheel with his laptop open between them. He showed her the RF flag first, explained the passive monitoring system, what frequency it had detected, what the timestamp meant. Celeste listened without interrupting. Then he showed her the photographs of the rotor arm, the missing retaining pin, the collar. She looked at those for a long time. "You're telling me someone removed that pin before the demonstration," she said. "I'm telling you the pin is absent in a way that isn't consistent with mechanical failure during flight. What that means? I'm not drawing conclusions out loud." "But you have a conclusion." "I have a photograph and a question." Celeste looked out through the rain-streaked windshield. The medical team was loading the litter patient into an ambulance. Greer was at the command tent doing paperwork. Damien Cross had moved. Nathan scanned the lot and found him near the SAR van, still on the phone. 3 equipment failures in 14 months, Celeste said again, as if she was taking inventory. An emergency locator that activates and then dies. A demonstration sabotage 2 days before a major acquisition announcement, and a corporate officer making encrypted communications from inside a rescue coordination tent. She let out a slow breath. Someone didn't want that demonstration to succeed. And someone didn't want us to be found quickly. "Those are your conclusions," Nathan said. "Not mine. Stop being careful. I'm not a prosecutor. I'm a CEO who just spent 26 hours on a frozen cliff." She turned to look at him directly. Who benefits if the acquisition falls through? Nathan had thought about this in the 3 hours of the search flight, in the way your mind works problems in the background when your hands are doing something else. The Vantage Dynamics acquisition. Sterling Aerospace buying a smaller but strategically positioned defense contractor. The deal had been in progress for 8 months, and Damien Cross had been the internal opponent. He'd argued against the acquisition at the board level twice, on the grounds that Vantage's rescue technology portfolio overlapped with existing Sterling programs and would create redundancy. Programs he ran. Programs that would become redundant if Falcon X, a search drone that outperformed everything in Damien's division, succeeded in a public demonstration. Nathan said none of this. "I think you should talk to Captain Devlin," he said, "and I think you should do it before Mr. Cross finishes that phone call." Celeste was already opening the door. What happened next happened fast. Nathan was 2 steps behind Celeste crossing the parking lot when he saw Damien Cross look up from the phone, register Celeste's direction of movement, and make a decision. It was visible. The specific micro-expression of a man who has run out of time and knows it. He said something short into the phone and pocketed it and moved to intercept. "Celeste." His voice was controlled, professional, the voice he used in board meetings. "The medical team wants to do a proper evaluation before you sell. I need to speak with Captain Devlin." "There's time for that. Right now you need Damien." She stopped and looked at him, and whatever was in her face made him stop too. "The helicopter's emergency locator. Who signed off on the equipment certification before this flight?" Silence. "That would be a routine sign-off," Damien said. "Operations handles those as a matter of squon. Who signed off?" The rain was coming down harder. It tapped on the roof of the command tent, on the hoods of the vehicles, on the aluminum equipment cases stacked near the SAR van. Greer had appeared at the tent entrance. Captain Devlin was behind him, watching. Damien Cross looked at Nathan. It was a specific kind of look. Not the corporate irritation, not the contained authority. Something older and more basic than that. The look of someone calculating odds. "You have no idea what you're involved in," Damien said. To Nathan, quietly. "Whatever she's told you, whatever you think you've found." "I found 4 people alive on a cliff," Nathan said. "That's what I found. The data your drone collected, the RF logs. Those are proprietary Sterling systems you were monitoring without authorization. Any evidence derived from—" "I built the monitoring system," Nathan said. "It's my firmware, on my drone, that you told me to keep when you fired me." Damien's jaw tightened. "There are people above my level who have been managing a situation for a long time," he said, and now his voice had dropped to something that wasn't quite a threat and wasn't quite not one. You pulling this thread does not end with a press conference and a handshake. You understand me? There are contracts. There are government relationships. There are people who do not want this examined. Then they should have built better emergency equipment, Nathan said. Devlin stepped out of the tent into the rain. Mr. Cross, she said, I'm going to ask you to stay in the area. We have some questions. Damien Cross stood in the rain and looked at the four of them. Devlin, Greer, Celeste, Nathan, and did the math that everyone in that parking lot was already doing. He put his hands in his jacket pockets. I want a lawyer, he said. That's your right, Devlin said. This way, please. Nathan sat in his truck for a long time after that. The rain came down. Through the windshield, he watched Devlin's team set up a secondary interview space in the main tent. Not for the survivors, for Damien Cross, who sat in a folding chair with his arms on his knees and stared at the floor. A state police officer stood near the exit. Damien's satellite phone was in an evidence bag on the table. Nathan had his laptop open on the passenger seat where Celeste had been sitting. He was looking at the RF transmission log again. The timestamp. The frequency. He'd cross-referenced the frequency against the FCC allocation database during the drive north 2 nights ago, when he'd been looking at the storm radar and deciding whether to come. He'd noted it as a loose thread, and then the rescue operation had absorbed everything else. Now he pulled up the cross-reference again and looked at it properly. The frequency wasn't registered to Sterling Aerospace. It was registered to a shell company called Meridian Signal Partners, incorporated 18 months ago in a state with minimal disclosure requirements. No public-facing business. No website. One registered agent whose name, when Nathan searched it, came back to a law firm that specialized in government contract advisory services. 18 months ago. The same month Sterling Aerospace had first announced the Vantage Dynamics acquisition discussions. The same month the first piece of Sterling emergency equipment had failed in a field incident. Nathan sat with that for a while. The rain on the roof of the truck was steady and cold. Out the window, an ambulance pulled out of the parking lot. The litter patient, heading to the nearest trauma center. Greer was on the radio again. The sky over the Bitter Peak Ridge was fractured now, gray and white in pieces, the storm starting to pull apart at the edges. His phone buzzed, unknown number. He almost let it go to voicemail. Then something made him answer. Mercer. The voice on the other end was male, older, with the flat effect of someone accustomed to delivering information without emotional context. You're at the Bitter Peak Rescue Command Post. Who is this? Someone who's been watching the Meridian signal situation for considerably longer than you have. A pause. The RF logs you collected. Don't submit them through the rescue command chain. Nathan's hand tightened on the phone. Why not? Because 2 of the people in that command chain have relationships with Meridian's registered law firm. The data will be misrouted, and you'll spend the next 8 months in civil litigation while the people who need to see it never do. Another pause. There's a federal investigator named Holt at the regional SAR oversight office. She's been building a case on Sterling's equipment failures for 11 months. She needs what you have. How do you know what I have? Because I helped build Falcon X's firmware, the voice said. Not directly, but the passive RF monitoring module. The base code came from a defense contractor I did compliance work for 6 years ago. I recognized the architecture when your drone's data hit a certain monitoring threshold. Nathan stared through the windshield at the tent where Damien Cross was sitting across from a state police officer. Who are you? He said. Someone who made a different call than you did, the voice said. When I found something I shouldn't have found, I didn't go to a parking lot at 4 a.m. with a drone. I went quiet, and people got hurt because of it. A long pause. Don't go quiet. The line went dead. Nathan sat in his truck in the rain with a dead phone and a laptop full of evidence that was suddenly more dangerous than he'd understood 20 minutes ago. And outside the tent window, Damien Cross was talking to a lawyer on a borrowed phone with the careful, deliberate calm of a man who had done this before. And somewhere in the Sterling Aerospace Tower in the financial district, a system of relationships and contracts and covered evidence was already in motion responding to what had happened in the last 3 hours. And Nathan Mercer, terminated engineer, drone builder, the man who'd been told his machine was a toy, had approximately as long as it took for that system to reach him to decide what to do next. He opened the laptop. He found the contact information for the SAR Oversight Regional Office. He looked for an investigator named Holt. The regional SAR Oversight Office had a main number and a directory. Nathan found neither helpful. He sat in the truck with the rain coming down and worked through the office website on his phone, looking for an investigator named Holt, finding instead a general intake form and a media contact and an organizational chart that listed 11 positions without names. The kind of bureaucratic structure that was designed to be navigated by people who already knew who they needed to reach. He didn't know who he needed to reach. He had a name from a dead phone line from an unknown caller and a laptop full of data that the same unknown caller had told him not to run through the people who were 20 feet away and actually in a position to act on it tonight. He thought about that for a minute. Then he called Mara Voss. She picked up on the third ring, which meant she'd been awake, which at 6 in the morning said something about how the last 72 hours had gone for the people still inside Sterling Aerospace. Nathan. Her voice was flat and carefully neutral, the voice she used when she didn't know who else was listening. I need a name, he said. Federal Investigator, SAR Oversight, goes by Holt. Silence on the line, long enough that he counted to 4. Where are you? She said. Bitter Peak Rescue Command. Another silence. They found them? She said. Yes. All 4 alive. He paused. Mara. The name. I don't know that name, she said, but I know someone who might. She exhaled. Nathan, I need you to understand something. What's been happening inside this company for the last 14 months? I knew something was wrong. I didn't know the shape of it. I should have pushed harder. You're pushing now, he said. The name. Call Dennis Falk, she said. He left Sterling 8 months ago. He went to work for a federal compliance consultancy. If this Holt is running something connected to emergency equipment procurement, Dennis will know the channel. Nathan wrote the number she gave him on the back of a gas station receipt with a pen he found in the door pocket. Be careful, Mara said. Damien has people, not just inside Sterling. I know, Nathan said. The frequency logs told me that. He hung up and sat for a moment with the rain on the roof and the truck's heater pushing warm air against his face. And then he dialed Dennis Falk. Dennis picked up immediately, which meant he'd been expecting a call from someone, if not from Nathan specifically, and the conversation lasted 4 minutes and was mostly Dennis talking fast and low from what sounded like a parking structure. The short version, Investigator Claire Holt, Federal Safety Compliance Division, had been building a case around a pattern of emergency equipment failures in government-contracted aerospace operations for 11 months. The failures shared a specific characteristic. They all involved equipment that had passed Sterling Aerospace's internal certification process under Damien Cross's division. The case had stalled 3 months ago when the primary documentary evidence had been flagged as potentially improperly obtained and was under legal challenge. She needed clean evidence. Evidence that couldn't be challenged on procurement grounds. Evidence collected by a privately owned drone operating under a private citizen's firmware during an authorized search and rescue operation, logged automatically by a system that had no connection to Sterling Aerospace's internal networks. She's going to want to talk to you today, Dennis said. Not tomorrow, today. How do I reach her directly? Dennis gave him a number. Then, Nathan, the Shell Company, Meridian Signal. What about it? It's not just Cross. There are 3 other names on the internal filing that never made it to the public disclosure documents. A pause. One of them is on the State Emergency Procurement Board. Nathan stared at the rain on the windshield. How long have you known this? He said. Long enough that I should have done something sooner, Dennis said. Call Holt. Claire Holt answered on the first ring. She had the specific vocal quality of someone who had been waiting for a particular call for a long time and had trained themselves not to show it and wasn't entirely succeeding. Nathan told her what he had: the RF logs, the missing retaining pin photographs, the Meridian signal frequency registration, the timestamp that placed an encrypted transmission from inside the rescue command tent at a moment that corresponded with the guideline crossing operation. She was quiet for most of it. When he finished, she said, "You said the drone's monitoring system logged the transmission automatically. Passive RF monitoring, built into the firmware. It runs continuously during flight operations and logs any transmission it detects in the emergency frequency bands, plus a 200 megahertz margin on either side. The meridian frequency fell inside that margin. And the drone was operating under SAR authorization at the time. Captain Devlin of the County Search and Rescue Command authorized the search flight. I have that authorization on record. Mr. Mercer." A pause. "Don't submit those logs through the Rescue Command documentation chain." "I've already been told that." A longer pause. "By whom?" "Unknown caller. Male. Older. Said he'd done compliance work for a defense contractor and recognized my firmware architecture." Silence on her end that had a different quality than the previous silences. Active. Processing. "I'm going to give you a secure upload address," she said. "You're going to copy every file on that laptop to it before you do anything else. Every flight log, every RF record, the retaining pin photographs, all of it. Do it now, while you're still at the command post, while the authorization chain is clean and documented and the timestamps are current. And then you're going to walk into that tent and act like a man who just helped find 4 survivors and is tired and grateful and has nothing more complicated than that on his mind." Another pause. "Can you do that?" Nathan looked through the windshield at the tent. Damian Cross was still inside. Devlin and Greer were at the table. The rain was coming down steadily. "Yes," he said. "Good. I'll be at the command post by 1400 hours. Don't talk to anyone from Sterling's legal team before I get there. Don't talk to Cross again. And for the love of everything," her voice dropped half a register, "don't tell anyone you called me." She gave him the upload address and hung up. Nathan opened the laptop and started transferring files. It took 22 minutes to upload everything. He sat in the truck and watched the progress bar and watched the tent and watched Damian Cross through the canvas opening, and when the upload finished, he closed the laptop and sat for another full minute just breathing, the way you breathe when you've just put something irretrievable into motion and there's no taking it back. Then he got out of the truck and walked into the tent and accepted a cup of bad coffee from Greer and answered 3 follow-up questions about the guideline rigging from Ruiz and helped break down the drone monitoring station equipment. And he did all of it with the careful, deliberate normalcy of a man who was not thinking about anything except being useful. Damian Cross watched him from the folding chair. Nathan didn't look back. At 11:40, a Sterling Aerospace Company vehicle arrived in the parking lot. 2 men in suits got out, legal team from the look of them. They went directly to the tent, and one of them spoke quietly with Damian for 30 seconds before Devlin stepped between them. "Mr. Cross is not available for private consultation at this time," she said. "He has the right to legal counsel." "He has the right to counsel present during any questioning," Devlin said. "We're not currently questioning him. We're asking him to remain available. His counsel is welcome to be present for that." She looked at the 2 men with the specific calibrated patience of someone who had managed lawyers at crime scenes before. "Have a seat." The lawyers sat. Nathan watched this from across the tent and noted the specific way Damian's posture changed when his legal team arrived. A loosening, a recalibration toward confidence. The look of a man who had reminded himself of what he had available to deploy. That look bothered Nathan more than anything else that had happened since morning. He excused himself and walked to his truck and sat with his phone and thought about what Dennis had said. There are 3 other names. One of them is on the State Emergency Procurement Board. If Cross had connections on the procurement board, he had connections to the regulatory infrastructure that would process any evidence that came through official channels, which was why Holt had told him to upload directly and stay quiet, which was why the unknown caller had told him not to use the rescue command chain, which meant that between the arrest, the evidence submission, and whatever legal machinery Damian's team was about to deploy, there was a window. A specific finite window during which the data Nathan had uploaded was the cleanest version of the truth available, and after which the legal challenge and the procedural delays and the document management that Damian's people were certainly already initiating would start to obscure it. He needed Holt to get there before that window closed. He checked the time. 10:53 in the morning, she'd said 1400 hours. 3 hours and 7 minutes. The first thing that went wrong happened at 12:18. Nathan was at his truck when Greer found him, and Greer had the look of a man delivering information he didn't fully understand and wasn't comfortable with. State police just got a motion from Sterling's legal team, Greer said. They're arguing that the drone's flight operations were conducted under a contested authorization. They're claiming Sterling Aerospace has a prior IP claim on the Falcon X design, and therefore the data collected during the operation is subject to corporate discovery protocols before it can be used in any investigative proceeding. Nathan stared at him. They filed that in the last 20 minutes, he said. Yes. We're at a mountain rescue command post. They filed a corporate IP motion against rescue operation data from a law office somewhere while their COO is sitting in a tent 40 feet away. I know how it sounds, Greer said. Does Devlin know? She's on the phone with the county attorney right now. Greer looked uncomfortable in the specific way of a man whose job was supposed to be about terrain and weather and finding people who were lost and who had found himself standing in the middle of something considerably more complicated. Nathan, did you... He stopped. Did I what? Did you keep copies of everything? Nathan looked at him steadily. I documented the operation thoroughly, same as any field operation. Greer held his gaze. He was a man who had been doing rescue work for a long time, and he understood the spaces between sentences. Good, he said. That's good. He walked back to the tent. Nathan got in the truck and called Holt. I know, she said before he finished the first sentence. I saw the filing come through. They're fast. Can they actually stop the data? They can try to delay it. A corporate IP claim against rescue operation telemetry is a stretch, but stretch is the point. You don't have to win the motion, you just have to create enough procedural uncertainty to buy time. She paused. I'm moving up my arrival. 11:30 if I push. What do you need from me when you get here? The original device, the drone's onboard storage. She paused. The uploaded files are good, but the chain of custody on the original device is stronger. If Cross's team challenges the integrity of the upload, the physical storage module is the unimpeachable record. Nathan looked at Falcon X in the transport case in the truck bed. I have it, he said. Keep it with you. Don't let anyone from Sterling's legal team near it. If they approach you about the device, you say nothing and you call me immediately. A beat. I mean nothing, Mr. Mercer. Not that you'll think about it. Not that you'll consult someone. Nothing. Understood. 11:30, she said. Stay visible. Well, the second thing that went wrong happened at 12:51. Nathan was standing near the command tent with a cup of coffee. He wasn't drinking, watching the parking lot with the passive alertness of someone who has spent enough time in situations that can go sideways fast, to have developed an instinct for the moment before they do, when a second vehicle pulled in. Not Sterling's legal team, different plates, SUV, dark blue, no markings. 2 people got out, a man and a woman. The woman had the bearing of someone accustomed to arriving at situations already in progress and taking stock quickly. The man was carrying a document case and moved like a lawyer. They went to the tent. 4 minutes later, Devlin came out and walked directly to Nathan. Her face was doing the thing faces do when someone is working very hard to stay in their professional register and is finding it effortful. The 2 individuals who just arrived, she said. The woman is from the State Emergency Management Office. She's presenting a directive from the State Procurement Board requiring that all technology and data associated with this rescue operation be submitted to a joint review process before being released to any federal investigative body. The State Procurement Board, one of the 3 names Dennis hadn't given him. That directive, Nathan said. Is it signed? Yes. Dated? Devlin looked at him carefully. This morning. The motion from Sterling's legal team had gone in at 12:18. The state procurement directive was dated this morning. 2 separate legal instruments from 2 separate bodies, both moving within the same 2-hour window to establish procedural control over the same evidence. That didn't happen accidentally. That was a coordination. Someone with access to both channels had pulled two levers simultaneously the moment the rescue operation had produced something that needed to be contained. Nathan looked at his watch. 12:53. Holt was 37 minutes out. "Captain Devlin," he said, "the woman from the state office. Has she specifically referenced the drone's onboard storage device?" Devlin's expression didn't change, but something moved behind it. "She referenced all data collecting technology associated with the operation," she said precisely. "I see," Nathan said. He held Devlin's gaze. She was a careful person. He'd understood that from the first hour. She operated within her authority, and she expected others to operate within theirs. And right now she was standing at the edge of two jurisdictional claims and a federal investigation timeline, and she was measuring all three. "You should probably stay near your vehicle," she said, "in case the federal representative has questions for you when she arrives." "I was thinking the same thing," Nathan said. He walked back to his truck, and he put the transport case on the seat beside him, and he locked the doors. Holt arrived at 1:19. She was not what Nathan had pictured from the phone call. She was maybe 45, compact, wearing the kind of practical field clothing that said she'd expected to get out of a vehicle and walk in weather, with a federal credentials case she showed to the officer at the command post perimeter without breaking stride. She found Nathan's truck in 11 seconds of scanning the parking lot, which meant she'd been told what to look for. She got in the passenger side. She looked at the transport case. "That's it?" she said. "Storage modules in the secondary compartment on the left side," Nathan said. "Sealed since the flight." "Good." She didn't reach for it. She turned and looked at the tent, where he could see through the canvas opening that the woman from the state office and one of Sterling's lawyers in Devlin were standing at the table with the expressions of people in a procedural argument that nobody was enjoying. "How long have they been at it?" "The state office woman has been here since 12:50. Sterling's team since 11:40. "And Cross?" "Still in the tent. His lawyers are with him." Holt nodded slowly. She had the stillness of someone who had been in rooms with people like Damian Cross before and had learned to move at a speed that felt slow until suddenly it wasn't. "Here's what's going to happen," she said. "I have a federal evidence preservation order signed by a district judge at 8 this morning. That order supersedes the state procurement directive and Sterling's IP motion both. The moment I walk in that tent, both of those instruments become legally ineffective." She paused. "The reason I'm telling you this before I walk in is that Damian Cross is going to know that the moment I walk in, and in my experience, the 3 or 4 minutes between the moment a man like Cross understands he's out of procedural options and the moment the handcuffs actually go on are the most unpredictable minutes of the whole operation." Nathan's hands were still on the wheel. "What do you need me to do?" he said. "Stay in this truck. Don't move until I come back out or until you see a situation that requires you to move. If Cross tries to leave, you don't stop him physically. You call the officer at the perimeter and you call me simultaneously." She looked at him directly. "You've done the hard part. You found them, you got the evidence clean, you held it. Now let the process work." "And if the process has the same problem the evidence chain had?" he said. "If there are more names?" "There are always more names," Holt said. "That's why you do it by the book, so none of those names can find a seam." She picked up the transport case. "I need the storage module." He opened the case and pulled the module from its housing, a sealed unit the size of a thick paperback, with tamper-evident tape across the access port that hadn't been broken since he'd armed it before the first flight. He put it in her hands. She looked at it for a moment. Then she put it in her document case, got out of the truck, and walked toward the tent. Nathan watched her go. The rain had slowed to a drizzle. The sky over the Bitter Peak Ridge was fractured into pieces, the storm breaking up in sections, weak afternoon light starting to come through the gaps. The parking lot smelled like wet gravel and diesel, and the particular cold, clean smell of mountain air after a long storm. Through the canvas opening of the tent, he watched Holt step inside. He watched her show her credentials to the woman from the state office. He watched Sterling's lawyers exchange a look. He watched Damian Cross, across the tent, register the federal credentials case. And he watched the specific, unguarded moment when Damian Cross understood what was in it, what it meant, and what was not going to happen next for him. Damian Cross stood up. His lawyers moved immediately. One hand on his arm, quiet, urgent words, the practiced reflexes of people whose entire function was to manage exactly this moment. Cross shook the hand off. He said something Nathan couldn't hear through the tent canvas. His lawyer said something back. Cross said something else, louder. Devlin moved. Greer moved. The state police officer who'd been standing near the exit moved. And Damian Cross, who had managed Sterling Aerospace's operations division for 9 years, who had signed off on equipment certifications and procurement contracts and shell company registrations and the specific work order that had removed a retaining pin from a drone's rotor arm 2 days before a public demonstration, took 3 steps toward the tent exit with an expression on his face that had finally dropped every professional register and showed something Nathan recognized from the photographs of the rotor arm. The bare, functional face of someone who had been doing what worked for so long that they'd stopped believing anything else was possible. Greer got to the exit first. He was a big man and he moved without drama, just positioned himself in the opening with his arms loose at his sides and his feet planted. And he didn't say anything, just stood there like something the mountain had put there. Cross stopped. Holt was behind him now, document case in hand, and she said 4 words in the same flat, carrying tone she'd used on the phone. "Sit back down." Cross stood between Greer and Holt in the drizzle that was coming through the open tent flap, and Nathan could see his profile from the truck. The jaw working, the hands at his sides, the eyes doing the rapid calculation of a man who had run out of options and was checking every exit one more time to be sure. There were no exits. Nathan's hand was on his phone. He hadn't dialed anyone yet, and in the suspended moment before everything moved again, with the rain coming down soft on the command tent and the light breaking through the bitter peak clouds in pale, exhausted pieces, the whole weight of the last 4 days, the demonstration, the firing, the drive north, the 3 hours of flight in a storm, the photographs, the phone calls, the 22-minute upload, settled onto Nathan Mercer's shoulders all at once, and he felt it the way you feel something you've been carrying so long, you forgot it was there until the moment you almost don't have to carry it anymore. Cross sat back down. Holt set her document case on the table, and in the truck in the parking lot, Nathan Mercer exhaled for what felt like the first time in 4 days, and watched the process that he'd spent every hour since Tuesday making possible finally begin to work. Nathan watched it from the truck. No drama in it. That was the thing about the actual moment, after everything. 2 state police officers, a set of handcuffs, and a man in a clean jacket being walked across a wet gravel parking lot to a patrol vehicle. Cross kept his chin up the whole way. The lawyers flanked him as far as they were allowed, talking fast, and Cross didn't respond to any of it. He got in the vehicle without being pushed, without a word, without looking back at the tent or the mountain or any of it. The patrol car pulled out. The parking lot felt different after that. Not lighter exactly. More like a room after a long argument finally ends, when the silence has weight to it and everyone is tired in ways they haven't fully measured yet. Holt came out of the tent at 2:03 and found Nathan still in the truck. She got in the passenger side and sat for a moment without speaking, the document case on her lap. "Cross is in custody," she said. "State and federal charges both. The lawyers will fight it. They're already fighting it. But the evidence chain is clean and the preservation order was signed before either of their instruments. So there's no legitimate procedural challenge to what we have." She looked out the windshield. "It's going to be a long process. Months, probably, maybe longer." "I know," Nathan said. "The 3 names on the Meridian signal filing. We've had 2 of them under surveillance for 7 months. Today gave us the 3rd. The state procurement board member resigned his position 40 minutes ago, which tells you he knew the call was coming." She paused. "The equipment failures. All 3 incidents. We have enough to establish a pattern of deliberate certification fraud going back 22 months. Nathan was quiet. "People could have died," he said, "in those incidents. Before this one. In one of them, someone did," Holt said. It was a flat statement delivered without effect, the way people in her line of work learn to carry things they can't put down. "A field technician, 18 months ago, equipment failure on a high-altitude site survey. It was ruled accidental." She paused. It wasn't. The rain had stopped. The lot was still wet, puddles catching the pale afternoon light coming through the breaking cloud cover above the ridge. Somewhere up there, above the Coldwater Cliffs, the ledge where the helicopter had gone down was empty now, cleared by Greer's team, the wreckage tagged and documented, the survivors 2 hours into their transport to the regional trauma center. "The man who called me," Nathan said. "This morning. Unknown number." Holt didn't say anything. "He said he'd made a different call than I did. When he found something he shouldn't have found, he went quiet, and people got hurt." Nathan looked at her. "That was someone connected to your investigation." "I can't speak to that," Holt said. "I'm not asking you to confirm it. I'm asking you to tell him—" Nathan stopped, started again. "Tell whoever it was that they helped. Today. Whatever they did before, however long they waited. Today they helped." Holt looked at him for a moment. Something moved in her expression, small and quickly managed. "I'll pass that along," she said. She got out of the truck, and Nathan sat alone in the cab with the heater running and the windows slowly clearing, and outside the command post was breaking down around him, tents being folded, equipment being loaded, the generator going quiet for the first time in 30 hours. The mountain was still there above it all, indifferent and enormous, the last of the storm clouds pulling off its ridgeline in long gray streamers. But he didn't leave immediately. He helped Greer's team break down the command post equipment because there was work to do and his hands needed something to do, and Greer didn't tell him to stop, just handed him a folded tent section and pointed at the staging area, and that was enough. Ruiz found him at the equipment van, loading cases. She was the team lead who'd crossed the ravine hand over hand on the guideline he'd dropped, who'd reached the crash site first and had been the first person to put hands on the survivors. She was compact and direct, and she moved like someone who was always slightly conserving energy for a situation that might require more. She stood next to him and picked up the other end of a case. 40 years of mountain rescue, she said. I've seen a lot of equipment. She looked at the transport case with Falcon X. That's the ugliest drone I've ever seen. I know, Nathan said. Crossed that ravine in 62-mile-per-hour wind carrying a 100-foot line. She shook her head. You test it here specifically, in the Bitter Peak range? 2 years of field tests, this terrain. Why here? Nathan thought about the honest answer, which was that he'd chosen Bitter Peak because it was the most unforgiving terrain within driving distance of the city, and Falcon X had been built for the places where other equipment stopped working, and you only know where that is if you go there. Because it's hard, he said. Ruiz nodded like that was the only sensible reason. You ever think about doing this for real? She said. Not the corporate demonstration circuit. Actual field deployment. Partnership with a SAR team. I've thought about it. Think about it more, she said. We operate in 6 mountain counties. Current aerial capability goes down the moment sustained winds hit 30. You saw what that means today. She handed him a card, plain County SAR logo, her name and a direct number. Don't lose that. He put it in his jacket pocket. She picked up the next case without ceremony and kept working, and he worked beside her, and neither of them said anything else. And somehow, that was better than anything that could have been said. Celeste Ashford found him at 3:40. She was in the back of a medical transport vehicle, her left arm properly immobilized now, a proper field dressing on the temple wound. She looked like someone who had been examined by paramedics and had argued about the transport timeline and had partially won. She was sitting upright in the back of the vehicle with the door open, and when Nathan walked past, she said his name in a tone that wasn't a request exactly, but wasn't a command either. He stopped. She looked at him for a moment. The afternoon light was coming through the breaking clouds in that specific pale gold way it does after a long storm, and it caught the damage on her face, the bruising along her jaw, the dark circles under her eyes. The particular hollowness of someone who had spent 26 hours burning through every reserve they had and was now running on fumes and force of habit. I was wrong about the drone, she said. Yes, Nathan said. I was wrong about you. He didn't argue with that either. Celeste looked at her hands for a moment, the right one, which was undamaged, and the left, which was wrapped and braced. I make decisions based on information. That's what I tell myself. What I actually do, a significant amount of the time, is make decisions based on appearance and frame it as information. She said it the way someone says something they've been working out in their head for a long time, and have finally arrived at the plain version of. What your drone looks like was never the relevant fact. What it could do was the relevant fact. I had 4 years of your testing data available to me, and I looked at the airframe and made up my mind before I read it. The demonstration was sabotaged, Nathan said. I know that now. It doesn't fully excuse the call I made. She looked at him. Nothing that happened today excuses me from the call I made. Nathan stood in the gravel with his hands in his jacket pockets and thought about the right thing to say to that, and what he arrived at was the truth. No, he said. It doesn't. Celeste accepted that. It seemed like she needed someone to accept it, rather than argue her out of it or soften it. She sat with it for a moment. I'm going to need to rebuild a significant portion of how Sterling Aerospace operates, she said. The safety program, the certification process, the internal culture that allowed Damien's operation to run unchecked for 22 months. A pause. I don't know yet if the company survives what's about to come out. The liability exposure is significant. That's not my problem to solve, Nathan said. No, she said. It isn't. Another pause. But if it does survive, if there's a company to rebuild, I'd like to have a conversation about what a properly resourced, properly independent rescue technology program looks like. Not a demonstration project, not a line item in Damien's division. Something with its own mandate and its own oversight. That conversation has conditions, Nathan said. I'd expect it to. Independent safety certification, third party. Not internal, not contracted to anyone with existing Sterling relationships. He looked at her steadily. Real-world testing mandates, not simulated environments. Operational partnerships with actual field teams, not procurement contracts. And if an engineer raises a safety concern, they don't lose their job before the concern is investigated. Celeste held his gaze through all of it. Yes, she said. And the families. Of the technician who died 18 months ago. Whatever Sterling's legal exposure is, they don't fight that. Something shifted in Celeste's face. Not surprise. She'd clearly already been told, or had worked it out. But the shift of someone who has been looking at a shape they understood as business liability and has just been asked to look at it as a human being instead. No, she said quietly. They don't fight that. The medical transport driver appeared around the side of the vehicle, keys in hand, the patient-ready expression of someone who had already extended this stop twice. Celeste looked at Nathan one more time. The drone, she said. What you named it? Falcon X. Why X? Nathan almost said it was just a designation, a project code, the kind of thing you name something in the early stages before you know what it will become. That was part of the truth. The other part was that he'd named it after 10, the number of field scenarios he'd run where every conventional system failed, and a drone built the way his was built would have been the only option. 10 scenarios that he'd documented in a proposal he'd submitted to Sterling's safety division 2 years ago, and that had been returned with a note that the use cases were too edge case to justify development resources. Because it was the 10th try, he said. Celeste nodded slowly. The transport pulled out. Nathan drove back to the city in the dark. He'd stayed at the command post until Greer's team finished the breakdown, until the last vehicle left the ranger station parking lot, until the lot was just gravel and tire ruts and the quiet the mountains always reclaim as soon as the humans leave. He'd stood there for a few minutes after the last truck pulled out, with the Bitter Peak Ridge above him and the first stars coming through the cleared sky, and then he'd loaded the last of his own equipment, gotten in the truck, and driven south. He didn't turn the radio on. The drive down out of the mountains was 2 hours on a 2-lane road that wound through pine forest and switchback grades, the headlights cutting a pale tunnel in the dark. His hands were steady on the wheel. His body was running on nothing. No sleep, bad coffee, 18 hours of sustained focus. And there was a specific kind of clarity that comes with that, a stripped-down quality to everything, the way the world looks when there's nothing left to filter it through except what's actually there. He was somewhere on the lower grade, maybe 40 minutes from the city, when his phone buzzed. Dennis Falk. He put it on speaker. Heard it went well, Dennis said. Holt got there, Nathan said. Chain of custody held. Cross is in county lockup. The lawyers are going to bail him by morning, but the federal hold will pull him back before noon. A pause. The other names. The procurement board member resigned. Holt told me, "There's going to be a lot of noise in the next few weeks. Press, regulatory hearings, Sterling's stock took a 17% hit in after-hours trading." Dennis paused. "You're going to be asked to testify." "I know. You ready for that?" Nathan thought about the retaining pin, the missing collar, the photograph he'd taken in Lab 7 on a Tuesday morning with a phone he was carrying out of a building he'd been told to leave by noon, the beginning of a thread that had taken 4 days to unspool into everything that had happened since. "Yes," he said. "Nathan." Dennis's voice shifted register slightly. "I'm sorry I didn't push harder. Earlier. When I was still inside and I had more access than I had courage." The road curved through a stand of pines, and the headlights swept across the bark and shadow, and Nathan drove through it and came out the other side. "You got me to Holt," he said. "Today that was enough." He could hear Dennis exhale on the other end of the line. "Drive safe," Dennis said. The call ended. Nathan drove. He got back to the city at 9:40 and stopped at a diner 6 blocks from his apartment because his kitchen had nothing in it and his body needed something real. The diner was the kind that had been in the same location for 30 years. Vinyl booths, laminate countertops, a pie case with 3 kinds rotating. It smelled like coffee and hash browns and the particular warmth of a place that stays open through the night because the city needs somewhere to go. There was a couple in a back booth, a man reading a newspaper at the counter, a cook visible through the pass-through whose movements had the economical rhythm of someone who'd been doing this long enough that it no longer required thought. Nathan sat at the counter and ordered coffee and eggs and toast and ate slowly, both hands around the mug between bites, and let the warmth of the place settle into him the way warmth does after you've been cold for a long time. Mara Voss texted while he was eating. Holt's office contacted Sterling's general counsel this afternoon. "Formal investigation notice. Board is convening an emergency session tomorrow. Celeste is calling it herself." He read it and set the phone down and drank his coffee. A minute later, another text from Mara. "For what it's worth? You were right about the pin." He stared at that one for a little longer. Then he put the phone in his jacket pocket and finished his eggs. The cook appeared at the pass-through with a plate of toast he hadn't ordered and slid it through without comment, which was the kind of thing that happens in diners at 10 o'clock at night when you've been sitting at the counter looking like you've had a specific kind of day. Nathan ate the toast. Chet. He got home at 10:30. His apartment smelled like machine oil and cold coffee, the same as it had when he'd left at 3:40 in the morning 21 hours ago. The kitchen table still had the marks from where Falcon X had been sitting. Oil stains and faint scratches in the laminate from the transport case latches. His laptop was where he'd closed it. The gas station coffee cup was still in the same spot by the sink. He put the transport case on the table and opened it. Falcon X sat in its padding, the same as always, asymmetrical, scarred, the mismatched rotor housings and the weld seams and the cracked casing that he'd repaired with whatever was in the shop. He looked at it for a while in the kitchen light. He took the left rotor arm off and held it under the lamp. The new arm, the one he'd replaced after the ravine crossing, was straight and clean. The mounting collar was intact. The retaining pin was exactly where it was supposed to be, doing the job it was supposed to do, holding a $30 component in place so that a machine could fly into a 62-mile-per-hour wind above a frozen mountain and find people who had no other way to be found. He set it down. He went to the storage shelf above his workbench and found the original left rotor arm, the one from the demonstration, the one he'd photographed in Lab 7 with a missing pin and a damaged collar. He'd wrapped it in a cloth and put it on the shelf without entirely knowing why, in the same way you keep a thing when you're not sure yet what it means. He put it back on the shelf. He wasn't sure he'd ever throw it away. 3 days later, Ruiz called. "We have a missing hiker situation developing. Upper Grayback Trail. Storm system coming in from the northwest. Should hit the search zone in about 6 hours. A pause. "Our aerial capability is currently rated non-operational due to wind forecasts." Nathan looked at Falcon X on the kitchen table, where it had been sitting since he'd gotten home from the diner. What are the projected conditions? He said. Sustained 45 to 50, gusts to 60. I can be there in 2 hours, he said. He heard something in the silence on Ruiz's end. Not relief exactly, but the sound of a problem finding its solution. Drive safe, she said. He packed the transport case and loaded it in the truck and pulled out of the apartment parking lot while it was still dark, the city quiet around him, the streetlights making orange pools on the wet pavement. He drove north with the heater running and the transport case strapped in the bed and Falcon X sealed inside it, and somewhere above the tree line the wind was already building, working its way down from the northwest the way mountain weather does, patient and enormous and completely indifferent to anything that might be caught in it. He drove into it anyway. He'd been driving into things like this for a long time. The difference now was that he understood what it was for. Not the demonstration, not the press release, not the acquisition timeline, or the board approval, or the $4 million line item in a development budget. The missing hiker on the Grayback Trail. The person caught in the weather with no way out. That was what Falcon X had always been built for, from the first weld seam to the last retaining pin. Not to be impressive, not to look right under the atrium lights, to go where everything else stopped and keep going, ugly and deliberate and precise, into the places where people had run out of options. He hit the highway heading north and put his foot down. The sky ahead was black and the wind was coming, and somewhere up in the dark a drone built from salvaged parts, and 3 years of stubborn refusal to quit, was about to do what it was made to do. Again, the same as it had always done. In the mountains that didn't care what anything looked like as long as it worked. Nathan Mercer drove north into the dark, and Falcon X rode behind him, and the storm was waiting, and none of that was a problem anymore. The Grayback Trail search took 9 hours, not because Falcon X failed to find the hiker. It found her in the 3rd hour, a 31-year-old woman named Carver who had twisted her ankle badly on a descent and gotten turned around in the deteriorating visibility before the storm hit. She'd built a reasonable shelter against a rock face, which had kept her alive, and when the drone's thermal camera swept across her position, she was conscious and moving, waving at the camera with both arms, in the particular frantic way of someone who has been alone in the cold long enough to stop taking the possibility of rescue for granted. The next 6 hours were Ruiz's work. The storm had hit harder than the 6-hour forecast, the way mountain storms sometimes do, and getting a ground team to Carver's position required 3 route changes, 2 anchor setups on glazed rock, and Ruiz making a judgment call in hour 7 that Nathan watched from the command position at the trailhead and understood to be the kind of call that gets made by people with decades of specific experience in their bones rather than their heads. Ruiz made the right call. They brought Carver out at 4 in the afternoon, hypothermic but stable, with a badly sprained ankle and the expression of someone who has recently recalibrated their understanding of how close certain lines actually are. In the parking area at the Grayback Trailhead, while the medical team worked, Ruiz came and stood next to Nathan without ceremony. 3rd time this year we've had a situation where aerial capability was non-operational, she said. I know. We need this to be a formal arrangement, not a phone call basis. She looked at him. I've been talking to the county emergency management director. There's a budget line for contracted aerial support. It doesn't cover much. This is county government, not the Pentagon. But it covers fuel and equipment maintenance and a retainer. Nathan thought about the Ruiz card in his jacket pocket, the one she'd handed him in the rain 3 days ago. I'm not looking to make money on this, he said. I know you're not. That's not the point. She turned to face him. The point is that if you're going to be part of the search and rescue capability in these counties, you need to be part of it properly. Accountability, documentation, insurance. You become a contractor, you get oversight, the team knows what to expect from you, and you know what to expect from the team. She paused. You can't just drive up a mountain every time your phone rings. I did that twice, and both times it worked, he said. Both times, she said. You were lucky that you got there before conditions got worse. A formal arrangement means pre-deployment positioning. It means coordination. It means we know you're coming before we need you, not after. Nathan looked out at the Grayback parking area, at the ambulance, at the trailhead sign, at the cloud cover breaking up over the ridge the same way it had broken over the Bitter Peak Ridge 3 days ago. Send me the contract, he said. Ruiz didn't smile. She was not someone who smiled easily or often, and he respected that. She just nodded, the same nod she'd given him when she checked the guideline rigging. That was enough. But the federal investigation into Sterling Aerospace's certification fraud went public 10 days after the Bitter Peak rescue. Nathan heard about it from Dennis Falk first, then from a news alert on his phone, then from 6 other people who all called or texted within the same 2-hour window. Former colleagues, an aerospace journalist he'd talked to once at a conference, 2 engineers he'd never met who had found his contact information somewhere and wanted him to know that they knew what he'd done and that it mattered. He didn't know what to do with that, so he didn't do anything in particular. The coverage was significant. Not just the arrest, the whole architecture of what Damian Cross had built over 22 months, the Meridian Signal Shell Company, the relationships on the State Procurement Board, the systematic underfunding of equipment quality while passing certification documents that said otherwise, the 3 field incidents that should have triggered independent investigation and hadn't. The technician who had died 18 months ago. His name was Marcus Webb. He'd been 28 years old, working his first major contract, and the equipment failure that had killed him on a high-altitude survey had been attributed to user error in the official finding. Marcus Webb's name appeared in the second paragraph of most of the major coverage. Nathan read all of it. He didn't feel triumphant about any of it. He felt the specific weight of things that should have happened sooner and didn't, which is a different feeling from victory and considerably harder to put down. He testified before a federal review panel 6 weeks after the arrest. 3 hours in a conference room in a federal building, documents and flight logs and photographs entered into the record, questions from 5 people who had clearly already read everything and were now building the formal structure around what they already understood. Holt was in the room. She didn't look at Nathan significantly or nod acknowledgement or do any of the things that would make the moment feel like a story reaching its conclusion. She sat at the side table with her files and her coffee and listened to his testimony with the same complete attention she'd brought to everything. And when it was over, she walked out of the conference room without ceremony, and Nathan didn't see her again. That felt right. She had a case to finish. Celeste Ashford called him 4 weeks after that. He was in his apartment working on Falcon X's upgraded navigation array, a new sensor package that Ruiz's team had identified as a gap after the Grayback operation, thermal imaging that could distinguish between an adult body and an animal signature at greater elevation. It was meticulous work, the kind that required the magnification light and good coffee and no interruptions, so he almost let the call go. He answered on the 4th ring. "The board voted last Tuesday," Celeste said. "Sterling Aerospace will survive, reduced, restructured, with a consent agreement with the Federal Safety Division that will govern our certification processes for the next 7 years." A pause. "We've also reached a settlement with Marcus Webb's family. I negotiated it personally. It won't fix what happened, but his mother won't spend the rest of her life in a legal fight against a corporation." "Good," Nathan said. "The Vantage acquisition is off. Too much liability uncertainty. What that means is that the division overlap Damian was trying to protect no longer exists as a concern." She paused again. "The independent safety technology program I mentioned at the command post. The board has approved a foundational budget." Nathan set down the sensor housing. "I'm listening," he said. The conditions he'd named in the back of the medical transport vehicle, Wochtam Okogoy, the ones Celeste had accepted in the rain with dried blood on her temple and 26 hours of frozen mountain in her body. She had converted them into actual contractual language, which her legal team had drafted and which she now read to him in precise, unambiguous terms. Independent third-party certification. No Sterling-affiliated contractors in the review chain. Real-world field testing in actual operational conditions, documented by the contracting SAR teams, not by Sterling's internal teams. Operational partnerships with county and state emergency management agencies, not procurement relationships. Whistleblower protection language that was, as Celeste put it, the strongest her legal team had ever been asked to draft. Her words. And a line item for an endowment in Marcus Webb's name, funding an annual scholarship for aerospace engineering students from working-class backgrounds. His mother had been consulted. She had agreed. Nathan listened to all of it. There's one more thing, Celeste said. All right. I want you to lead it. The program. A pause. Not report to me. Not report to the board through me. A direct board relationship with an independent mandate and the authority to escalate safety concerns to the federal oversight level without going through Sterling's internal chain. Another pause. Which means you would have the authority to cause significant problems for this company if you found something that warranted it. That's the point, Nathan said. Yes, she said. That's the point. Nathan stood at his workbench with the sensor housing in one hand and the phone in the other, and outside his apartment window, the city was doing what the city does. Moving, noise, the particular compressed life of a lot of people in a small space. And he thought about Lab 7 and the demonstration and the 4 words that had followed him out of the building. This is a toy. I have conditions of my own, he said. I assumed you would. I keep the county SAR contracts. The program doesn't conflict with that work. It supports it. Any technology developed under the program gets licensed to emergency agencies at cost. Not market rate, cost. Agreed. I hire my own team. No approval process through HR or department heads. My hire. My accountability. Agreed. And Falcon X stays mine. Not Sterling IP mine. A brief silence. That one will require some documentation work, Celeste said, given the development history. I know. That's why I'm asking you to agree to it before the lawyers get involved. A pause that was different from the others. Not hesitation, more like someone recognizing the shape of a negotiation they've been outmaneuvered in and deciding to accept it. Agreed, Celeste said. Nathan set the sensor housing down. Send me the draft contract, he said. Pop. Mara Voss was his first hire. She'd spent the 6 weeks after Cross's arrest doing the kind of intensive internal documentation work that happens when a company is trying to understand the full extent of what it didn't know. And by the time Nathan called her, she was, in her own words, exhausted and furious and in need of something to work on that wasn't a post-mortem. You'd be running operations, he told her. Logistics, contracts, field coordination. The part that isn't the engineering. I've been running the part that isn't the engineering for 6 years, she said. The difference being that this time the engineering would actually be real. Yes. And I'd report to you, not to Celeste's office, not to the board, not to anyone who has ever signed a document approving equipment they knew was defective. To me, Nathan said, and then to the federal oversight level if something requires it. Mara was quiet for a moment. When do I start? She said. His second hire was a structural engineer named Yael Otto, who had spent 4 years doing field work and mountain rescue in the Pacific Northwest before moving back east to be closer to family. She'd been working for a commercial drone manufacturer for 2 years, doing work she described in their first conversation as technically adequate and completely without stakes. She saw Falcon X during the interview and spent 12 minutes asking questions about the rotor arm design before Nathan interrupted to ask if she wanted the job. She did. His third hire came from a different direction. Dennis Falk, who had spent 8 months at a federal compliance consultancy and was good at it and hated it, called Nathan 2 months into the program's formation and said he thought he could be useful. You know where the gaps in Sterling's certification process are, Nathan said. Every single one, Dennis said. I spent 20 months watching them and not saying anything loud enough. I'd like to spend some time saying things loudly. You'd be working inside a Sterling-funded program, Nathan said. Knowing Cross's people are going to watch everything we do for the first 2 years at minimum. I know. And you're comfortable with that. I'm more comfortable with it than I was with going quiet, Dennis said. Nathan hired him. 8 months after Damian Cross's arrest, Falcon X flew its first officially documented mission under the new program's operational mandate. It was a training exercise, a simulated search scenario in the Grayback Range, coordinated with Ruiz's County SAR team and 2 state emergency management agencies, designed to establish baseline performance metrics under real field conditions. Not a demonstration, not a board presentation. A working test with Yael on the engineering documentation and Mara running the coordination and Dennis handling the compliance paperwork, and Ruiz's team treating the whole thing with the professional seriousness of people who were going to stake their operational decisions on what it showed. The exercise took 4 hours. Falcon X performed above baseline on 11 of 13 metrics, below on 2, both involving a specific lateral sensor configuration in crosswind above 6,000 feet that Yael had flagged in pre-mission review, and that the exercise confirmed as a development priority. After the exercise, while the debrief was running and Yael was going through the telemetry data with 2 members of Ruiz's team, Nathan took Falcon X to a flat rock at the edge of the staging area and looked it over. The original frame was still there, under the new sensor housings and the upgraded navigation array. The weld seams, the mismatched rotor mounts from the repair after the Bitter Peak crossing, the crack in the secondary sensor housing that he'd patched with material from the shop, and that he'd chosen not to replace when Yael had suggested it, because the patch held and there was no operational reason to pull a working repair. The left rotor arm was the third iteration, the one that had been on it during the Bitter Peak rescue, that had crossed the ravine above 200 feet of empty air in a 62-mile-per-hour wind carrying a 100-foot guideline, had been replaced during the program's rebuild process. Yael had recommended it, minor stress fracture in the joint casing that wasn't visible without the magnification equipment. She'd been right. Nathan kept that arm on the shelf at home, next to the original one with the missing pin. He had 2 of them now. 2 arms that had done what they were built to do and then come apart in the process, which was not failure, which was exactly what materials science said would happen under sufficient stress, which was the truth of anything built to be used rather than looked at. He put the drone back in its case. Ruiz found him at the staging area. She stood beside him for a moment the way she did most things, without preamble, without social navigation. "Good exercise," she said. "The lateral sensor issue is real," he said. "Yes, but fixable." "Yes." She looked at the transport case. "You know what we used to do when aerial capability went down? Before you." She paused. "Wait. We waited, and we called for additional ground teams. And we ran the probability calculations on survival windows, and we put our people into terrain that required twice the time and 3 times the risk." She said it the same way she said everything. Flat, factual, without drama. "Twice in 14 years, we lost someone on the ground team in those conditions. Not the missing person. Our team." Nathan didn't say anything. "That's what the lateral sensor issue costs when it costs," she said. "Not a metric on a performance chart. That's what this is for." She picked up her gear bag and walked back toward the debrief without another word, and Nathan stood at the edge of the staging area and looked up at the grayback ridge, and thought about what she'd said, and thought about Ruiz's 2 team members, and thought about Marcus Webb, and thought about a woman in an atrium saying, "This is a toy," in front of 200 people, and thought about the truth, which was that all of it had led here, to a flat rock at a trailhead in a mountain range, with a drone in a transport case and a sensor issue to fix, and 4 people who showed up to do the work without it needing to be anything other than what it was. The year ended with Falcon X logging 47 field operations. Not all of them rescues. Some were training exercises. Some were condition surveys. Some were equipment calibration runs that Yael needed for the sensor development work. But 23 of them were actual deployments, actual situations where someone was in terrain that the weather had made inaccessible to conventional aerial support. Of the 23, 19 resulted in confirmed survivor locations. The other 4 were recovery operations, which was a different kind of work with a different emotional weight, and Nathan's team learned to carry it the way field people learn to carry those things. Not by putting them down, but by learning where to put them so you can still do the work. One of the 19 was a child, 7 years old, separated from a family hiking group in the Bitter Peak Range. The same range, different trail, different season. The first warm weather of spring, with the snow melt making the creeks loud and the terrain unpredictable. The boy had gone off trail following something, the way children do, and by the time the family understood what had happened, the wind had come up and the county's aerial unit was grounded. Ruiz called Nathan at 2 in the afternoon. He was on site by 4:30. Falcon X found the boy in the second hour of the search, sheltered in a hollow beneath a root formation, scared and cold and completely intact. He was sitting with his knees pulled up to his chest, and when the drone appeared above him, he looked up at it, and then he did something Nathan watched on the thermal monitor and didn't expect. He waved. A small, uncertain wave. The wave of a 7-year-old who wasn't entirely sure the machine above him was there for him, but was choosing to believe it anyway. Nathan kept the drone in hover above the boy's position and fed the coordinates to Ruiz's team, and Ruiz's team went in and brought him out, and the whole thing took 3 hours from Nathan's arrival to the moment the boy was in his mother's arms in the parking area at the trailhead. Nathan was breaking down the equipment when the mother found him. He didn't know she was there until he heard her, and when he turned, she was standing 6 feet away with her son's hand in hers, and the specific expression of someone who has recently experienced the gap between the world where their child is gone and the world where their child is standing next to them, and is still living in both simultaneously. She didn't say anything for a moment. "Thank you," she said. That was all. Nathan nodded. He didn't know what else to do. He wasn't good at these moments. He was better with the equipment than with what came after. And he knew that, and he'd made peace with it. But the boy looked at the transport case and said, in the direct way that children ask things, "Is that the drone?" "Yes," Nathan said. "Can I see it?" He looked at the mother. She shrugged, the shrug of a woman who had decided that for the rest of this day, her son could have whatever he asked for within reason. Nathan set the case on the tailgate of the truck and opened it. The boy looked at Falcon X for a long moment. The scarred frame, the mismatched housings, the weld seams. "It's kind of beat up," the boy said. "Yeah," Nathan said, "but it found me." "Yes," Nathan said. "It did." The boy thought about this with the seriousness that children bring to things that have recently mattered to them. "That's good," he said. Nathan closed the transport case and loaded it and drove home in the early dark of a spring evening, the mountains behind him and the city ahead, and somewhere on the highway he realized he was not thinking about the demonstration, or the firing, or the 4 words, or the retaining pin, or any of it. He was thinking about a 7-year-old waving at a drone in a hollow under a root formation, choosing to believe the machine above him was there for him. He drove home. He put Falcon X on the kitchen table. He made coffee and drank it standing at the window and looked at the city doing what cities do, and he thought about Yael's sensor data and what the next iteration of the navigation array needed, and he thought about Mara's contractor coordination schedule for the following month, and he thought about the lateral crosswind issue and the 3 approaches he'd been turning over in his head since the grayback exercise. There was a lot of work left. That was fine. That was, in fact, exactly what he wanted. Not the completion, not the arrival, but the specific texture of a problem that was real and mattered and was his to work on, with people who showed up and did their part, in terrain that didn't care about anything except whether the thing you built actually worked. He set down the coffee cup. He sat at the kitchen table under the lamp. He opened the sensor housing and went back to work. The lateral crosswind sensor issue took Yael 6 weeks to solve. Not because she wasn't fast. She was fast, methodical in the way that engineers who have done real field work tend to be, where the standard for done is whether it holds up in conditions rather than whether it passes a lab benchmark. It took 6 weeks because the problem turned out to be layered. A calibration drift in the primary sensor that only manifested above a specific wind gradient, compounded by a software interpolation gap in the navigation algorithm that Nathan had written 2 years ago and that had worked fine until the drone started operating consistently above 6,000 feet. 2 separate issues wearing the same symptom. Yael caught the distinction in week 3, during a bench test that Nathan had thought would confirm the hardware fix was sufficient. She came to him with the test data and laid it out without softening it. "The calibration fix resolves 40% of the deviation," she said. "The other 60 is in the algorithm. The interpolation function makes assumptions about wind gradient linearity that don't hold above certain elevations." Nathan looked at the data. She was right. He'd written that interpolation function himself, and he'd written it for the elevation range he'd been testing in at the time, and he hadn't revisited it when the operational profile expanded. "How long to rewrite?" he said. "The function itself? 2 days?" Validation testing to make sure the rewrite doesn't introduce new behavior in the lower elevation range? 3 weeks. Do it, Nathan said. She did. The validation testing took 22 days, which was within her estimate, and when it was done, the lateral sensor performance above 6,000 feet came within operational margin on every test run they put it through. Nathan watched the final validation flight on the monitor in the staging area at Grayback, with Yael beside him and Ruiz standing back far enough to give them room, but close enough that she caught everything on the telemetry feed. When the flight completed and the numbers came through clean, Ruiz looked at the data for a long moment. "That's the gap closed," she said. "Yes," Yael said. Ruiz nodded. Then she pulled out her county SAR operations log. An actual paper log, the kind that had always struck Nathan as anachronistic until he understood that it was intentional, that Ruiz maintained a paper record as a backup to the digital system because she'd been in situations where the digital system was the thing that failed, and made a notation. Nathan watched her write. He couldn't read the notation from where he stood, but he understood the weight of it. A line in a record that said the aerial capability for this county's mountain search and rescue operation had changed, and when it had changed, and why. Those records mattered. Marcus Webb's family knew how much they mattered. Damian Cross's trial began 14 months after his arrest. Nathan testified for 2 days. He'd been prepared by Holt's team in 3 sessions over the preceding month, going through his testimony line by line. Not to shape what he would say, but to make sure he understood the legal architecture well enough to say it accurately. Holt had a particular way of preparing witnesses. She didn't coach, she clarified. She asked him to explain things until he arrived at the version that was complete and precise and couldn't be usefully misrepresented in cross-examination. The cross-examination from Cross's defense team was aggressive and detailed and lasted most of the second day. They challenged the chain of custody of the RF logs. They challenged Nathan's characterization of the retaining pin absence as deliberate. They challenged his qualifications to make assessments about equipment, certification processes he hadn't been directly involved in. They suggested that his presence at the rescue command post had been motivated by personal grievance against Sterling Aerospace following his termination, and that his actions throughout the operation should be understood in that context. Nathan answered every question the same way he'd answered Holt's questions in the preparation sessions. Specifically, accurately, without embellishment or defensiveness. When the answer was that he didn't know, he said he didn't know. When the answer required technical precision, he provided it and didn't simplify it to be more accessible, because accuracy mattered more than accessibility in a federal courtroom. On the second day, Cross's attorney asked him directly, "Mr. Mercer, isn't it true that your primary motivation in coming to the Bitter Peak Rescue Command Post was to prove that your drone could perform after the failed demonstration?" Nathan looked at the attorney. "My primary motivation," he said, "was that 4 people were missing in terrain and conditions where my drone could operate and nothing else available could. That was the whole of it. And the fact that one of those 4 people was the CEO, who had terminated your project and your employment, had no bearing on your decision?" Nathan took a moment. Not because he didn't have the answer, but because the question deserved a complete answer, and he wanted to give it correctly. "Celeste Ashford was one of the 4 people," he said. "She was also the person with the authority to make the decisions I believe needed to be made about how Sterling Aerospace operates. If she hadn't survived, those decisions either wouldn't have been made or would have taken considerably longer to make." He paused. "So yes, the fact that she was one of the survivors mattered, but not the way you're suggesting." The courtroom was quiet for a moment. The attorney moved on. Damian Cross was convicted on 11 of 14 counts. The sentencing came 6 weeks later. 7 years federal, with additional civil liability proceedings still pending related to Marcus Webb's death and the other field incidents. Nathan was not in the courtroom for the sentencing. He was in the Grayback staging area running a pre-deployment check on Falcon X with Yael, because there was a weather system developing over the northern range, and Ruiz had called a readiness check. He found out about the sentence from a text message from Holt. 4 words, 7 years. It held. He read it and put the phone in his jacket pocket and finished the pre-deployment check. The program's first full-year report went to the Sterling Aerospace Board in month 13. Mara had compiled it. 84 pages of operational data, field performance metrics, agency feedback, equipment development progress, and financial accounting. It was thorough in the way Mara did everything, which was to say it was designed to be completely resistant to misinterpretation. Nathan presented it in person at a board table he'd never sat at before, in a building he'd last been in when he was carrying a transport case out through the loading dock. The board asked good questions. Some of them asked the kind of question that was less a question than a budget concern wearing a question's clothes, and Nathan answered those the same way he answered the real ones, accurately, specifically, without advocacy. At the end of the presentation, one board member, a woman named Parrish, who had been on the board for 11 years, and who had, according to Mara's background research, voted against the Vantage acquisition and against Damian Cross's last 2 budget requests, asked a question that wasn't on the prepared list. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "when you drove to the Bitter Peak command post 14 months ago, before any of this existed, before the program, before the contracts, before the testimony, what made you go?" Nathan thought about this. "The same thing that makes anyone go," he said. "Someone needed something, and I had it." Parrish looked at him for a moment. "See that doesn't get complicated," she said. "I'll do my best," he said. Spring came back to the Bitter Peak Range the way it always did, slow and reluctant, the snowmelt running loud in the creek beds while the upper elevations stayed frozen until nearly June. Nathan drove up to the range on a Saturday morning in early April, not for a deployment, not for a training exercise, just to drive. He parked at the Bitter Peak Ranger Station, the same building whose parking lot had held the rescue command post 15 months ago. The lot was empty on a Saturday morning in early April, just his truck and the ranger station and the trailhead signs and the mountains behind them. He got out and stood in the parking lot for a while. The Coldwater Cliffs were visible from here on a clear day, and this was a clear day. The sky, pale blue and enormous above the ridgeline, the upper elevations white with the last of the winter snowpack. He could see the cliff face but not the ledge. The ledge was hidden by the angle of the terrain, which was why it had been so hard to find from the air. He thought about the thermal monitor, the pale shape resolving through the snow cover, the heat signature moving. Someone down there was still fighting. He'd thought about that moment a lot in the last 15 months. Not obsessively. He wasn't built for that kind of dwelling, or he'd trained himself out of it, which amounted to the same thing. But he came back to it occasionally, the way you come back to something that crystallized, something true for you at a moment when you needed clarity. A person you'd never met, in terrain you couldn't reach, choosing to keep moving because stopping wasn't acceptable. That was the thing about the people his drone found. They were already doing the hardest work before Falcon X ever appeared. They'd made the decision to keep going in the dark and the cold without any evidence that anyone was coming, and that decision was what made them findable. You can't locate someone who has stopped. He got back in the truck. He drove down the mountain and stopped at a diner on the lower grade. Not the one near his apartment, a different one, smaller, with 6 tables and a counter and a handwritten specials board. He ordered coffee and a plate of eggs and read through Yael's latest sensor development notes on his phone while he ate. The notes were dense and specific, and he read them slowly, making mental annotations about 3 areas he wanted to talk through with her on Monday. The eggs were good. The coffee was better than the gas station coffee from 15 months ago, which was a low bar but a real one. A man at the counter, older, with the specific weathered quality of someone who spent a significant portion of his life outdoors, glanced at Nathan's phone. "You with the rescue program?" he said. Not intrusively, the conversational register of someone who'd noticed something and was curious. "Yes," Nathan said. "The drone program, out of Sterling Aerospace. Operationally independent. Sterling funds part of it. County and state contracts cover the rest." The man nodded. "My nephew does trail maintenance on the upper Grayback. He said the county SAR team has been running exercises up there, with a drone that flies in the bad weather." "Yes." The man wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "He said last spring, during that situation with the lost kid, the 7-year-old, your drone found him in 2 hours." "Closer to 90 minutes from deployment," Nathan said. The man was quiet for a moment. "My wife went missing in the Bitter Peak Range," he said, 11 years ago. before any of this. He looked at his coffee. They searched for 4 days, lost aerial capability after the first day due to weather, found her on the 5th day. A long pause. She survived. But the 4 days in those conditions, she was never quite the same after. Nathan didn't say anything. "I'm not saying it would have been different," the man said. "I know you can't say that. I'm just saying I'm glad the thing exists now." He looked up. Whatever it took to make it exist. He put money on the counter and left. Nathan sat with his coffee for a while after that. He thought about the man's wife, somewhere in this mountain range 11 years ago, in the dark and the cold, waiting. He thought about the 4 days and what that cost. He thought about Ruiz saying that's what this is for at the Grayback staging area. And he thought about Parrish at the board table saying, see that doesn't get complicated. And he thought about a 7-year-old waving at a drone in a root hollow, and about a woman with a thermal blanket around her shoulders saying, "This is a toy," in a voice that had nothing performative left in it. He left money on the counter and went outside. The mountains were right there, the same as always, enormous and patient and indifferent. He drove back to the city with the spring light coming in low through the driver's window, and he thought about Monday's meeting with Yael, and the sensor notes, and the 3 areas he wanted to discuss, and the next iteration of the navigation array, and the work that was waiting. There was always more work. He drove toward it.